Picture a sprawling, fully staffed mansion in Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Inside, you have this 20-year-old self-made millionaire.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't just live there, you know. The entire property basically operates as a 24/7 broadcasting studio.
Right, like a content house.
Exactly. He streams every waking moment of his life to a recurring audience of, like, over 170,000 viewers. He has the kind of internet fame and, well, financial resources most people can't even fathom.
I mean, with that kind of money at 20, you can do whatever you want.
Yeah. If he wanted to fly to Tokyo for dinner tonight, he literally could. But instead, he spends his time insisting that taking someone on a simple bowling date is a completely unjustifiable waste of his time.
A bowling date. Wow.
Right. And even stranger, just to handle the basic everyday act of speaking to another human being. He relies on this intense cocktail of highly restricted pharmaceuticals.
It creates this fascinating tension right away, you know?
Really?
You're looking at a young man who has achieved the absolute pinnacle of modern digital cloud.
Oh, for sure.
Yet his entire empire is built on this foundation of profound, self-imposed isolation. I mean, he has engineered a life where physical manipulation is the only thing that matters. Human connection is treated almost like a disease.
And that tension is exactly what we are unpacking today. We are going deep into this hyper-niche, rapidly expanding internet subculture known as Looksmaxing.
It's a dark one.
It really is. And to figure out what is actually happening here, we're relying on two incredibly revealing sources. The primary one is an on-the-ground, feature-length interview by the YouTube channel Channel 5 with Andrew Callahan.
That's a great channel. They really get in there.
They do. Andrew took a whole camera crew into that Fort Lauderdale mansion to sit down with this 20-year-old figurehead of the movement. He's a guy who goes by the internet handle Clavicular, or just Clav for short.
And then, to help us contextualize what Clav is actually saying, our second source is a critical commentary video by the political and social commentator Vaush. Vaush basically watches the Channel 5 interview and provides this real-time psychological analysis of the movement. He really breaks down the mechanisms of what Clav is doing, not just to his own body, but to this massive audience of young men who are hanging onto his every word.
So if you're sitting there thinking this is just some quirky TikTok trend where teenagers are trying out weird haircuts or, I don't know, buying expensive face creams, put that out of your mind right now.
Yeah, this is way beyond skincare.
Way beyond. We are exploring a worldview rooted in radical biological determinism. It's this ideology that really took root during the pandemic, and it drives its followers to extreme chemical and surgical lengths just to achieve what they call ascension.
Ascension. I mean, just the word itself sounds almost cult-like,
Yeah.
but to really grasp the extreme actions of this community, you first have to understand their language.
Yeah, the vocabulary is wild.
It is. You have to understand the architecture of this digital world they built when the physical world shut down. And the best place to start is with the leader himself, Braden Peters or Clav.
So he was born in 2005. Let that sink in for a second.
It's crazy to think about. And to give you some perspective on how fast this happened, less than a year prior to the Channel 5 interview, he was working as a line cook at a restaurant in Hoboken, New Jersey.
Wait, really? A line cook to a fully staffed Florida mansion in under 12 months?
Exactly. I mean, he started posting his daily routines on TikTok. Initially, he claims he wasn't taking it too seriously, but he was already deeply embedded in these highly specific, really tight-knit online forums.
Okay.
And eventually, he moved his streams to a platform called Kick. Kick is known for having much looser moderation rules than Twitch, right? And his popularity there just completely exploded.
But to actually follow his rise, we need to dig into that vocabulary you mentioned. The bedrock term is looksmaxing.
Right.
At its surface level, you know, it sounds like basic grooming, like maximizing your looks. But in this community, it is the practice of optimizing your physical appearance to the absolute extreme. And it's completely tethered to another acronym, which is SMV.
SMV, or sexual market value.
Yes, sexual market value.
That concept is crucial here. It basically reduces the entire human experience into a transactional marketplace. In this worldview, your physical traits are literally the sole currency that determines your worth in society.
Or pause on the social hierarchy they've built around this, because it gets incredibly bleak very fast. Clav frequently throws around the word jester.
Oh yeah, the jester.
When he uses that term, he's describing someone who has completely misplaced their priorities. Like, a jester is a guy who tries to win people over with his sense of humor, his personality, or his kindness, rather than, say, his jawline.
Because to Clav, relying on personality means you've failed at biology.
Precisely. He gives this specific example in the interview of a guy trying to get taller by doing bunny hops for hours on end.
Bunny hops?
Yeah, just jumping up and down. Clav calls that gesturing. He's basically writing it off as this ridiculous, pathetic coping mechanism.
Yeah.
And the absolute opposite of being a jester, in their world, is mogging.
Mogging is the ultimate goal in these spaces. It's the act of dominating someone else simply by having a superior physical presence.
Without even speaking.
Right. Exactly. You don't have to say a word. If you walk into a room and you are taller, leaner, and have more angular facial features, you are actively mogging every other man in that room. It is dominance through pure aesthetics.
How do they even measure that, though? I mean, human attraction is so subjective. If you and I walk into a room, some people might prefer your look and some might prefer mine. It's fluid, you know?
Well, in the real world, yes, it's very fluid. But in the subculture, they have violently rejected subjectivity. They use something called the PSL scale.
The PSL scale. Okay, break that down for us.
The source material points out that PSL stands for 3 early internet forums where this entire ideology incubated. Those are PU Hate, which was a forum for men who were disillusioned by the pickup artist movement, Sleuthate, and Lookism.net.
Sleuthate? I mean, just the name alone tells you a lot.
It really does. These forums developed a shared, rigid ranking system. It categorizes men in a strict caste system. The absolute peak is what they call the gigachad, and the bottom tier is literally referred to as subhuman.
It's just hard to overstate how calculating this is. Clav's core philosophy is that every single human trait, like every action you take, is filtered through what he calls a facial harmony score.
Right.
He actually sits there in the interview and claims that the actor Matt Bomer currently maxes out this score.
They calculate this harmony score by taking millimeter-precise measurements of facial ratios.
Millimeters. Seriously.
Yeah, literally measuring the width of your eyes relative to the width of your cheekbones, the distance between your nose and your upper lip, the exact angle of your jaw. They plug all these numbers into a formula to generate a percentage.
And Clav argues that this percentage literally dictates reality. He says if you are incredibly handsome, if your ratios are perfect, and you act shy at a party, society perceives you as mysterious.
All right, he's the brooding, mysterious guy.
Exactly. But if your ratios are off, like if you have acne or you're balding, and you display the exact same shyness, society suddenly labels you a recluse or a creep. The behavior hasn't changed at all. The only variable is the facial math.
What you're seeing here is a total collapse of context. He is deciding that shared history, personal charm, emotional intelligence, none of it exists. Biology is destiny.
Okay, let me try to frame it this way, because it sounds like he is treating the human experience like a role-playing video game.
That's a good way to look at it.
Right, so imagine you're at the character creation screen before the game starts. You have a limited number of skill points to distribute. Clav genuinely believes that appearance is the only stat that actually unlocks the rest of the game.
Yeah, everything else is useless.
Right. If you try to put points into charisma or intelligence or empathy, you are wasting your time because the game's code just doesn't recognize those stats. He says outright that unless you are a historical anomaly, like a Beethoven-level genius, you simply cannot compensate for a lack of looks.
The video game framing is very relevant here, especially when you look at the timeline of Clav's life. Let's go back to his birth year, 2005. That means right around the time he was 13 or 14 years old, the COVID-19 pandemic hit.
Oh, wow, yeah.
That is a critical developmental window. It's when young teenagers are supposed to be out in the world, stumbling through awkward socialization, learning how to read body language, figuring out who they are relative to their peers.
Just going to the mall and hanging out.
Exactly. But instead, he was completely isolated in online schooling.
He talks about that isolation in the interview, right?
Yeah.
He mentions being totally stripped of organic interaction.
He does. And when you strip away the messy, unpredictable world of organic human connection, young men like Clav find community elsewhere. He actually calls it Discord maxing.
Discord maxing?
Yeah. They retreated to these highly analytical internet forums. They took the terrifying prospect of socializing and turned it into a sterile, controllable metric. If you can't control the outside world, you can control your mid-face ratio.
He actually uses the phrase video game cheat code when he starts talking about his early experiments with pharmacology. It's wild to hear him be so completely dismissive of what you or I would consider just a normal life.
He really is.
Like Andrew Callahan asked him what he thinks about regular social interactions, and Clav says the average guy drinking a beer and watching Sunday football is just ladering.
Ladering being their slang for wasting your life.
Right. He says that instead of watching a baseball game or hanging out at a pub with friends, young men should be logging onto PubMed and reading peer-reviewed scientific literature on aesthetic enhancement. He literally views joy as inefficient.
Which forces us to look at the practical application of this ideology. I mean,
Sure.
if you genuinely believe your facial measurements are the sole barrier between you and a fulfilling life, how far are you willing to go to change those measurements?
Yeah.
We have to transition from internet slang into the actual physical protocols these young men are putting themselves through.
And this is where the deep dive stops being about niche internet weirdos and becomes a genuinely alarming medical discussion. We are talking about teenagers engaging in extreme do-it-yourself body modification.
The sources detail a suite of extreme interventions. One of the more visceral examples they discuss is a practice known as bone smashing.
Ugh, just the phrase makes my stomach turn. What is the actual mechanism they are aiming for there?
Well, the underlying concept is a crude misinterpretation of Wolff's Law.
Okay, what is Wolff's Law?
Wolff's Law is a real medical principle stating that bones will adapt to the loads under which they are placed. If you put stress on a bone, it will calcify and grow denser to handle that stress.
Right, like how weightlifters have denser bones.
Exactly. So in the Looksmaxing community, guys are taking hard objects and repeatedly striking their facial bones, specifically their cheekbones or jawlines, to create microfractures.
Literally hitting themselves in the face with objects.
Yes. The hope is that as the bone heals, it calcifies and creates a more pronounced, angular, hypermasculine facial structure.
But Clav actually pushes back on that in the interview, doesn't he?
He does. He tells Andrew that people obsess over bone smashing because it sounds sensational and crazy, but he personally thinks it's a bit silly for achieving real results.
Okay.
He does quickly clarify that he has smashed his cheekbones, just not his jaw, but he pivots the conversation. He insists the true secret to the ascended look isn't pulverizing your face with a hammer, it's achieving an impossibly extreme level of leanness.
Right, but how he gets to that leanness and how he manages his other aesthetic goals is where the pharmacology comes in. Clav openly discusses looking into limb lengthening surgeries to get taller.
Yeah, breaking your legs to add a few inches.
Exactly. He talks about Botox, and he mentions using injectable fat dissolvers. Apparently, injecting those fat dissolvers into his own face on camera is what originally got him so much clout in these forums.
Right.
But I want to focus on the endocrinology hacking because this genuinely stunned me.
The hormone manipulation is arguably the most dangerous aspect of this whole thing.
He talks very casually about advising teenagers, kids who are in the middle of puberty, on how to manipulate their growth plates. He lays out this logic that you have the most control over your physical architecture while your biological growth pathways are still open.
Which is technically true, but horrifying to exploit.
Right. So to get taller, his protocol involves taking aromatase inhibitors. Wait, can you break down the actual biology of what an aromatase inhibitor does and why a teenager would want it?
Of course. So to understand this, you have to look at how human bones grow. In adolescence, the ends of your long bones have areas called epiphyseal plates or growth plates.
Okay, growth plates.
These are made of cartilage, and as you grow, this cartilage eventually hardens into solid bone. Once those plates fuse, you cannot grow any taller. Now, the biological trigger that causes those plates to fuse is actually estrogen.
Wait, really? Even in young men?
Yes, even in men. Men naturally produce testosterone, and an enzyme in the body called aromatase converts a portion of that testosterone into estradiol, which is a form of estrogen.
Okay, I'm full.
It's that rising level of estrogen during late puberty that signals the bones to stop growing. So Clav's protocol uses aromatase inhibitors to block that enzyme.
Oh.
By preventing the testosterone from converting into estradiol, they crash their estrogen levels, hoping to keep the growth plates open longer. Then, while the plates are artificially kept open, they introduce HGH, human growth hormone, to force the body to keep growing upward.
He is treating the human endocrine system like a Mr. Potato Head.
Yeah.
He's taking a teenager's delicate hormonal balance and just ripping out the estrogen to hijack the growth cycle.
It's incredibly dangerous, and the pharmaceutical lengths they go to for that extreme leanness are just as severe. Clav discusses using GLP-1 agonists.
Oh, the weight loss drugs.
Right. These are drugs you've likely heard of in the mainstream recently. Ozempic, tirzepatide, retatrutide.
But wait, hold on. How are these guys even getting their hands on GLP-1s if they aren't diabetic?
Yeah.
And they're already incredibly thin?
They often source them through gray market research chemical sites or compounding pharmacies online. But what's critical here is how they use them. They aren't using them for standard weight management.
What are they using them for, then?
Well, GLP-1 drugs work partly by slowing down gastric emptying, which makes you feel full, and interacting with receptors in the brain to reduce appetite. Clav and his followers take these drugs to intentionally nauseate themselves.
They're using diabetes medication to induce sickness.
Yes, the goal is to kill their hunger signaling entirely so they can endure starvation diets of 300 to 500 calories a day.
That's nothing.
It's literal starvation. And they do it without the mental torment of craving food because the drug makes them too sick to want to eat. Clav states point blank that the fastest way to drop weight is to just straight up starve yourself. They want to strip away every single ounce of subcutaneous fat to reveal a skeletal, razor-sharp facial angularity.
You hear the word looksmaxing and you think of self-improvement.
Yeah.
But listening to this, it becomes very clear that this is self-destruction. I mean, Clav isn't just manipulating his metabolism. He's aggressively altering his neurochemistry just to get through a normal day.
Oh, the segment on what he calls meth-maxing really highlights the severity of this chemical reliance.
He sits there on camera and admits to Andrew Callahan that when he first started gaining traction on social media, he was using methamphetamine to lean out as rapidly as possible.
It's wild to just admit.
And the way he defends it is even wilder. He argues that taking a 10-milligram line of meth is chemically basically the same thing as taking Adderall or dextroamphetamine.
Right.
He tells Andrew that the only reason meth has a stigma is because of, like, biker meth being cooked improperly in bathtubs. He says pure methamphetamine is just an efficient tool.
Just an efficient tool. Incredible.
But the stimulant abuse is only half the equation.
Yeah.
He also talks about relying heavily on a drug called pregabalin.
Right, pregabalin. That is typically prescribed as an anticonvulsant to treat seizures or to manage severe nerve pain like fibromyalgia.
Why does a 20-year-old streamer need an anti-seizure medication?
He uses it to artificially suppress his nervous system. Pregabalin works by binding to calcium channels in the central nervous system, which in turn reduces the release of excitatory neurotransmitters, specifically one called glutamate.
Glutamate. Okay, what does glutamate actually feel like to a person?
Think of glutamate as your brain's gas pedal. When you are alert, excited, or crucially anxious and panicked, glutamate is firing rapidly, sending fast excitatory signals across your neurons.
Okay.
Clav is taking pregabalin to chemically cut the brake lines on his anxiety. He uses it to induce a low-inhibition, numbed-out state so he can endure the social interactions required to run his live stream.
Wow.
He explicitly admits that he suffers from such crippling social anxiety that he cannot function around other people or be entertaining on camera if he is sober.
So if we picture his brain like a chaotic, overwhelming rock concert, the pregabalin is essentially forcing earplugs onto his neurons just so he doesn't have a panic attack when someone says hello.
That's a great way to visualize it. And this brings us to a profound observation that Vaush makes in his commentary video.
Oh yeah, this was a great point.
What's fascinating here is that Vaush points out a deeply tragic historical irony. For decades, we have culturally analyzed and condemned the damage caused by toxic, impossible beauty standards inflicted upon young women.
Right, the magazines, the models.
Exactly. The starvation diets, the extreme cosmetic surgeries, the deep-seated psychological self-hatred that occurs when a teenage girl looks in the mirror and realizes she doesn't look like an airbrushed magazine cover. Vaush observes that Clav is taking that exact same standard of agonizing, impossible self-objectification and inflicting it onto a generation of young men.
It's almost like a dark, mirrored reflection of feminist critique. Instead of realizing these beauty standards are toxic and dismantling them, the Looksmaxing community is just aggressively adapting them for men so everyone can suffer equally.
And you cannot ignore the ethical black hole this creates. You have a 20-year-old broadcasting these highly complex, highly dangerous chemical protocols to 170,000 viewers, many of whom are Gen Alpha kids.
Yeah, that's the scary part.
The cognitive dissonance is staggering because Clav actually understands the science well enough to know how dangerous it is.
He does. He warns his own audience during the interview. He says, look, if you start mixing human growth hormone with a high-carbohydrate diet, you're going to give yourself diabetes.
Right.
He warns them that if they mess with their estrogen levels using aromatase inhibitors, they could suffer from severe neurotoxicity, wild mood swings, and a completely flatlined libido. He says you have to be meticulously researched to do this safely.
But then what does he say right after that?
In the exact same breath, he admits that his followers are, quote, lazy, and that they won't actually do the research.
He is fully aware that he is handing a loaded weapon to teenagers who don't know how to use the safety, yet he completely washes his hands of the inevitable misfires.
Yeah, it's just reckless.
It really highlights the massive disconnect between his pursuit of an idealized physical form and the collateral damage being done in the real world to achieve it.
Which brings up a massive structural contradiction in this whole movement. We've spent all this time establishing the mechanics of what they're doing.
The how.
Right, the starvation, the methamphetamine, the bone smashing, the hormonal alchemy. But the obvious question is, why? If you are going through all of this agonizing physical suffering to maximize your sexual market value, you would assume the end goal is to succeed in the sexual marketplace.
You would assume the goal is to attract women, date, and form relationships. But that is where the logic completely fractures.
Right, because if he has the perfect mid-face ratio, why isn't he out dating? Clav claims that chasing women is a mega waste of time.
Mega waste of time.
He tells Andrew that even if you optimize yourself and become this elite slayer, sleeping with a different girl every single night, your life won't actually improve. He claims it will get worse.
When Andrew asks him about the value of just simply connecting with a woman, going on a date, getting to know someone, Clav's immediate response is, where's the ROI in that? What's the return on investment?
Everything is a transaction.
He cannot comprehend human intimacy unless it provides a tangible, measurable payout.
He takes it a step further and mocks the entire concept of starting a family. He sits there and jokes that the only logical reason a man would have a child is to mold them into a Tiger Woods-style golf prodigy.
That part was insane.
Right. He says that when the kid turns pro, you can leech off their earnings in your old age and avoid going to a nursing home. He acts like the only utility a child provides is either financial backing or content for his TikTok live.
His transactional view of human beings extends into a very dark, pseudo-scientific obsession with gender and sexual history, too. He states on camera that a woman's body count, meaning the number of previous sexual partners she has had, should ideally be absolute zero.
And he tries to back this up with science, right? Something about brain chemistry.
He attempts to. He uses a highly bastardized interpretation of pair bonding.
Okay, what is that exactly?
In behavioral endocrinology, pair bonding often refers to the release of hormones like oxytocin and vasopressin during mating. It was famously studied in prairie voles, which form lifelong monogamous bonds.
Prairie voles, so we're comparing humans to rodents now.
Exactly. The Looksmaxing community takes this concept, completely misapplies it to complex human sociology, and argues that every time a woman has a sexual encounter, she permanently damages her brain's capacity to chemically bond with a long-term partner.
But let me guess, this fragile pair bonding chemistry doesn't apply to the men in this community.
Of course not. When Andrew asks him if men lose their pair bonding value through promiscuity, Clav immediately says no.
Shocking.
And his justification isn't biological anymore, it's suddenly historical. He claims that because societal framing has favored male dominance for centuries, a man's promiscuity simply gives him experience, allowing him to put his foot down and leave a bad relationship. It's entirely hypocritical.
It's just a fractured, twisted logic to justify misogyny. And Vaush does a phenomenal job of dismantling the physical aspect of this getting girls narrative anyway.
Oh, Vaush's observation here is crucial for understanding the delusion at play.
Vaush watches the interview and looks at Clav's physique. Clav is incredibly lean, almost skeletal, but he doesn't have thick build muscle.
No, he's very slight.
Vaush points out a harsh reality that anyone who has ever spoken to a woman knows. Dropping to 7% body fat and obsessing over your cheekbone measurements has practically nothing to do with what women actually find attractive.
Right. Vaush notes that while the guys on lookism.net are starving themselves on Ozempic to make their abs visible, many women actually prefer a stronger, thicker physique built by compound exercises.
Because abs are muscles. You don't reveal an impressive core just by starving away your body fat. You have to build the muscle tissue up.
Vaush points out that dropping to a skeletal 7% body fat is something guys do to impress other men, or bodybuilders. Clav is chasing a hyper-niche, extreme aesthetic ideal that women aren't even asking for.
So, if I'm hearing this right, let's look at the full picture. You are physically optimizing yourself to the absolute peak of human capability.
Yeah.
But you hate interacting with people.
Yep.
You think dating is a waste of time. You view children as depreciating financial assets. And you require literal methamphetamine and anti-seizure medication just to step foot into a club without having a debilitating panic attack.
It's a paradox.
If you remove connection, love, and community from the equation, What exactly are you ascending to?
That is the pivotal question of the entire documentary, and Vaush provides an incredibly cutting insight to answer it.
Let's hear it.
This entire movement, the forums, the PSL calculations, the surgeries, the pharmacology, it is not about attracting women. It is a massive, elaborate defense mechanism born from a profound, paralyzing terror of women and the fear of rejection.
That's a shield.
Precisely. Think about the reality of human dating. If you walk up to a woman at a bar, make yourself vulnerable, and ask her out, she might say no.
Sure, happens all the time.
She might find you boring, or she might just have a boyfriend. That rejection hurts. It wounds the ego. But if you reduce attractiveness to a rigid mathematical formula, if you convince yourself that the only thing that matters is an eye to cheekbone ratio, you create a simulated environment where you can guarantee success.
Because if the math is perfect, they can't lose.
Exactly. A young man on these forums can look at his measurements and say, look, my numbers are perfect. I have ascended. They achieve victory in a vacuum. By declaring that women are a waste of time, they never actually have to test their sexual market value in the real world, because the real world is messy, subjective, and unpredictable. This ideology allows them to feel superior while completely removing actual living, breathing women from the equation.
That vacuum you're talking about is perfectly, almost hauntingly illustrated at the very end of the Channel 5 video.
Oh, at the club.
Yeah. Andrew is hanging out at a Miami club with Clav and his entourage. They have a VIP section. They're surrounded by women. The music is blaring. And Andrew asks one of Clav's associates why all these women are there.
And his answer is chilling.
The associate explains it using a term he calls trickle-down economics.
It is a staggering level of detachment.
The associate literally says that he invites all these women to the VIP section because it makes him look high status. But since he can't possibly sleep with all of them himself, the women trickle down to his friends to, quote, take care of.
Listen to the language being used there. The women aren't human beings with their own desires or agency. They are commodities.
Just objects in a room.
They are resources to be hoarded, displayed for clout, and then distributed among the group to validate the men's status. It showcases a total absence of genuine human intimacy.
But a 20-year-old taking meth on a live stream, preaching starvation and hormone manipulation to teenagers, well, that doesn't stay a secret forever.
No, it eventually leaks out.
When this kind of extreme behavior spills out of the Discord servers and into the real world, how does the algorithm and the media handle it? Andrew Callahan breaks this down using ground news, mapping out the wider cultural and political response to Clavicular.
And the way the media ecosystem fractures around this topic is very telling. We should be clear that we are looking at this impartially. We aren't taking a side here, but simply observing how different political spheres react to this radical source material.
Right. So according to the ground news analysis, mainstream left-leaning media has been highly critical. Outlets like Out Magazine and GQ have published scathing hit pieces on Clav and the Looksmaxing movement.
Which makes sense given their focus.
They frame the subculture as a hypertoxic, dangerous manifestation of modern masculinity, heavily criticizing the bone-smashing tutorials and the unregulated peptide injections.
Conversely, if you look at the right-wing media ecosystem, you find almost total silence.
Silence.
Yeah. They aren't writing hit pieces condemning him, but they aren't writing op-eds defending him either. He's effectively ignored by major conservative outlets. However, the Channel 5 report raises an interesting question about underlying quiet support.
Like what?
They note that tech billionaires like Peter Thiel might be quietly signal boosting this kind of antisocial biological determinism. Thiel and others in his sphere have shown interest in radical life extension and biological optimization, which shares a philosophical overlap with Clav's ideology.
It's a strange overlap, but I see it.
The result of this media dynamic is that Clav is essentially left alone. The left critiques him from afar, the right ignores him, and he is free to build an isolated, subcultural empire without any real mainstream interference.
But just because the mainstream media ignores it doesn't mean it doesn't have real-world consequences. That isolation hasn't prevented massive controversies from erupting. For instance, the community held what they called a Goonversary Vigil.
Yes, this was a highly disturbing event. The vigil was for a man named Nautica Malone, who tragically took his own life after a video went viral of him exposing himself to workers in a coffee shop drive-thru.
Now, to be fair to the source material, Clav actually condemns Malone's actions on camera.
He does.
He states clearly that exposing your genitalia in a drive-thru is sexual harassment and that it ruins the optics of the movement. Yet, despite his condemnation, the wider community still mobilized to hold a vigil for the man, treating him as a martyr of sorts.
There was another significant incident where Clav was permanently banned from all major clubs in Miami.
Oh, right, the Sprinter van incident.
He was in a Sprinter van with his entourage, and someone in the van played a Kanye West song that explicitly praised Hitler. Clav insists he didn't play the song, didn't control the O chord, and had nothing to do with it. But the association was enough to get him blacklisted from the nightlife scene.
Despite all of this, the hit pieces, the controversies, the ties to biological determinism, here's where it gets really interesting. Clav remains absolutely adamant that Looksmaxing is totally apolitical. He insists it is purely an objective scientific self-help tool.
Right, just science.
But I'm struggling to understand how we can accept that premise.
Why do you think the apolitical label fails here?
Because we are talking about an ideology born on incel forums, literally places called Sleuthate and Lookism. It's a movement that places the blame for societal unhappiness entirely on hypergamy, the idea that women only date the top percentage of men and the mid-century sexual revolution.
That's a huge part of their lore.
Clav argues that the sexual revolution caused people to abandon religion and traditional family structures, turning sex purely into a pursuit of hedonistic pleasure rather than procreation and pair bonding. Can an ideology with that specific foundation ever truly be considered apolitical?
The short answer is no, it cannot. Clav might view his daily actions as pure individual optimization. He evaluates whether to eat a carb based on its ROI, but his underlying worldview is deeply political.
How so?
He explicitly states in the interview that the framing of relationships favored men for centuries in male-dominated societies, and he implies that this dynamic needs to be restored to fix the modern dating market.
So he wants to roll back the clock.
He does. He views human interaction through a hyper-capitalist, ruthlessly transactional lens where women are treated as depreciating assets and men are perpetually trying to optimize their market value to avoid being screwed by the system. That is a fundamentally political stance regarding how society should be organized, regardless of whether he is endorsing a specific political candidate or party.
It's just endless data to him. Everything is an equation. But if the face is just a math equation to them, what happens when the math doesn't add up?
The illusion shatters.
All of these contradictions we've discussed, the physical perfection paired with the severe social misery, the internet fame paired with the utter isolation, it all comes to a head in a very tense, very revealing breakdown at the very end of the Channel 5 interview.
This is the moment the facade finally cracks.
Andrew Callahan is sitting with Clav in the studio. They've spent over an hour discussing facial ratios, meth, aromatase inhibitors, and the collapse of societal values. And then Andrew asks him a painfully simple human question.
He asks the only question that matters.
He looks at Clav and asks, when you wake up every single morning and you take a look in the mirror, are you 100% satisfied with every single thing?
It's a question about self-acceptance, and Clav's reaction is incredibly defensive.
He doesn't even look him in the eye and say yes.
No, he gives a very dismissive, almost annoyed, yeah, more or less, and then he completely derails the entire interview.
He gets furiously angry. He accuses Andrew of being disingenuous and doing a shitty job. And why is he mad? Because Andrew didn't ask enough scientific Looksmaxing questions.
He felt insulted.
Clav is genuinely offended that Andrew didn't ask him about the specific biological mechanisms of hair loss or how different muscle-building peptides interact with each other. He acts like Andrew just failed a pop quiz on endocrinology, and he terminates the interview early.
This specific moment is what shifts Vaush's entire perspective on Clav. Throughout the beginning of the commentary, Vaush assumes Clav is just a cynical grifter.
Like someone just doing it for the money.
Right. He assumes Clav is someone in the vein of Andrew Tate, a guy intentionally exploiting vulnerable, insecure young men for financial gain while privately knowing it's all just a performance for clout.
But that changes.
Completely. Watching Clav get genuinely, visibly furious that a mainstream journalist didn't care about the minutiae of bone-smashing science changes Vaush's mind. A grifter would be happy to talk about their feelings if it made for good television. Clav's anger was real.
It's like watching a man build an incredibly complex, high-tech fortress to protect himself, and when you finally walk up to him and ask, hey, are you happy in there? He completely loses his mind because you didn't ask about the tensile strength of the titanium walls.
That is a perfect analogy.
He literally cannot step outside of his obsession. He lacks the self-awareness to realize that the average person watching this documentary doesn't care about the chemical structure of dextroamphetamine. They want to know, why a 20-year-old kid is doing this to himself.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Vaush points out the profound tragedy of this interaction. Clav is so deeply entrenched in his own body dysmorphia that a completely normal question about looking in the mirror feels like a violent targeted attack.
It's heartbreaking in a way.
Vaush also notes that this intense hyperfixation on specific, systematized details, like categorizing human beings by millimeter facial ratios, is very common among autistic individuals or those with neurodivergent traits who find themselves swept into these black pill communities.
That makes a lot of sense.
Clav cannot even fathom a reality where he isn't actively tormented by the demon of insecurity. That voice in his head telling him his mid-face ratio is slightly off is so deafeningly loud, he assumes everyone else must hear it too.
He built this entire ideology to protect himself from feeling insecure. But when Andrew just casually asks how he feels looking in his own reflection, it bypasses all the math, all the pharmacology, and hits the wound directly.
Yeah, the math couldn't save him from that question.
So I want to bring this back to you, the listener. If you aren't a 20-year-old streamer living in a rented mansion, if you've never been on a Looksmaxing forum, why should you care about any of this? Why does Clav's obsession matter?
It's a fair question.
Because this deep dive reveals something terrifying about our current digital ecosystem. If you've ever felt a pang of insecurity looking at a bad photo of yourself, imagine an algorithm multiplying that feeling by 1,000, providing you with a mathematical formula to prove why you are flawed, and then selling you the drugs to try and fix it.
It really demonstrates what happens to a generation of young men when algorithmic echo chambers replace empathy, connection, and vulnerability with cold, punitive, simulated metrics.
It's a sad reality.
It really is the ultimate tragedy of Clavicular. Here is a young man who genuinely believes he has found the ultimate cheat code to life. He thinks he has hacked the biological system.
But at what cost?
Exactly. He's trapped in a house with cameras monitoring him 24/7. He has to chemically suppress his own nervous system just to endure speaking to other human beings. And despite all the surgeries, all the starvation, and all the money, he is fundamentally unable to look in a mirror without seeing a flawed mathematical equation staring back at him.
He won the very game he created,
Mm-hmm.
but the prize is absolute misery.
Exactly.
And it leaves us with a question about where this all ends.
Mm.
We all have that desire for precision when we are hurting, right? We want the X-ray to show us exactly where the bone is broken so we can fix it.
It's human nature to want to fix the problem.
But if we eventually reach a point in the future where technology, surgery, and pharmacology allow us to perfectly customize our physical avatars in the real world, if we all manage to achieve a universal 10 out of 10 harmony score, will we finally be happy? Or will we just realize that by obsessively fixing the outside, we've entirely forgotten how to build the inside?